We are live here at Myth Vision. Sure, come on in closer, Dr. James D. Tabor. Welcome back to Myth Vision. How are you?
Good to see you, Derek. I'm looking forward. I thought it was Ask Tabor Anything, and now I see it's Challenge Tabor. So I'm a little bit, nervous.
I'm bringing the heat today.
I don't know if I want to be challenged, Derek. So.
Well, listen, if you weren't afraid already, let me show you why you should be. Look at what I did to Leviathan. Did I just do that again? I did. Okay. Are you more afraid before or after?
Let me tell you something. I've been teaching for 45 years in the North, in the South, in the West, California, Chicago, Virginia. I've sort of done the circuit. So you could imagine at state schools as well as private schools. I was at Notre Dame, William and Mary, been at UNC Charlotte for 33 years. I really don't think there's anything that hasn't been thrown at me at one time or another. So as long as I can remember what I think.
That's the difficulty.
I listened to you with Dale Allison, a week or so ago, and I loved it because he would say, I had an answer for that 20 years ago. I don't remember which way I went on that. And I love that. And it also shows that you change your mind. I've changed my mind on a number of things. Someday, let's do a show called How My Mind Has Changed and Stayed the Same. Maybe when I retire, which is going to be at the end of this year. 45 years is enough teaching. But I'm not retiring like sitting around doing nothing. I have unbelievable stuff planned, projects, filming, all kinds of archaeology, history. But that would be fun to do because you've changed a lot, Derek. Yeah. I've gotten to know you a bit over the past year, and changing is good.
It is. If you're wrong, to admit, I'm kind of a copycat. I mean, look at your shirt. Look at my shirt. I couldn't get my hair curled like yours. I tried. I also didn't have dye. I couldn't get it to turn white.
We both do filming, and we're going to do a lot of filming in October if we can rally the troops to help send you as my cameraman and my interviewer.
That's the goal.
But, I always try to wear black if I'm in an interview that I think is important. So this is actually a sign that I'm taking you very seriously. Otherwise, I'd have my Hawaiian shirt on or something,
Well, I want everybody to know you are a serious gentleman, and you have a YouTube channel I pinned in the chat. So please, if you haven't subscribed to Dr. Tabor's material, endless great content. He's publishing all the time, constantly putting up stuff. Usually it's stuff that you wouldn't find. It's in the crevices of the internet world that you just won't find that he's found. And you can find it all on his YouTube, but he's also doing new material. I will be with him in October in Israel. We will be recording and getting excellent content. Hopefully, we can put together the wonderful series we plan on doing online so everybody can go, and we'll probably tease you with little clips here and there on YouTube. But you'll want to definitely check out that tour, if you will, what we're going to be dealing with. So that's one thing. Lots of content there. If you haven't joined his blog, let me put that in the chat, jamestabor.com. He talks about all sorts of stuff that I love to talk about here at Myth Vision. Let me give you guys this link real quick here. All right, tell us about your blog. What is it that people can get?
Can you scroll down just one bit there? There's us today, but look at the post right beside it. Mm-hmm. And if you want to click on it, I think people will find this interesting. Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all converging this weekend. Ramadan for the Muslims, Passover coming up Friday night for Jews, and of course, Holy Week, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. So as you can see there, I put 19 links to just kind of, in some of these things we might want to talk about. Everything you ever wanted to know about Holy Week, And I'm using that in the historical sense of, Christians and Jews look back to this time. So it's just fascinating to me this time of year. Sometimes it's in March, sometimes it's in April because of the way the calendar works.
Right.
But you can, that post in particular is just going wild, just getting thousands and thousands of views. So I think people are digging in, because I've written a lot in the past about it. And instead of repeating all that, I just put the links up. So
awesome. Well, I hope people go join and help out by checking out the material. Please do so. Also, we have the Patreon. I work very hard here at Myth Vision. Look how crazy that, look at that face. Tell me that's not a hardworking looking face. I'm just teasing. Lots and lots of work. Seriously, you can message me there as well. And now let's have some fun. Dr. Tabor. I want to say up front before we get started, publicly, I've told you this privately, but condolences to your family for the recent loss of a wonderful patriarchal figure in your household. And I just want to make that special because the way that my audience works on YouTube, most of them are like a family. You could tell that they care. And so it's good to have that encouragement from people. And I just want to say that publicly for everybody also to keep that in mind.
Yeah, my father-in-law died last Thursday. He's 80. He was 88 and just such a good man. That's how I think of him. If you ask me to describe him, just pure gold. And we're going to miss him. He lived a wonderful life. And, when somebody dies at that age, you can be grateful, but you never get over the loss. And one of the things I'll say about that, whenever someone loses someone, as we say, or I just say die, people say pass away, whatever, really, everyone says sorry for your loss. And it can start sounding trite. My father was in the military. Your father is in the military. Yeah. And it almost reminds you of like a receiving line. I remember there was a Larry David skit in Curb Your Enthusiasm where everybody's thanking a soldier who's home from Afghanistan or maybe Iraq. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. And it starts sounding like, do we need like 50 people to say that? We thanked him, But you know what? I'm sorry for your loss. It's absolutely the best thing you can say because that's exactly what death is. No matter what you believe about it, they're gone. Try calling. Try contacting. I'm going to go by and see them. I want to talk. Over. And so that is the feeling you get is loss, even if the person lived a good life as my father-in-law did. But thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
I know you're a very compassionate person, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And I know you are as well. We've had some deep conversations on the phone. Sometimes we get lost for quite some time having deep conversations, and I always enjoy that with you. So I'm publicly portraying the relationship that I obviously have with you and learning from you. So thank you.
Does that mean you're going to go easy on me though?
No, that means I have to go harder. So I have to kiss your butt now, and then I have to bring the tough stuff. So we do have some super chats. And of course, I always appreciate people who do that. They have some questions. They might be difficult. Let's see what we have. Let's hopefully have answers that aren't 20 years ago that you had, but you don't remember. Sometimes you might have that happen. So Clark,
I think I remember most of mine, so we'll see.
You are really, I'm not going to lie, you're really, really good at remembering stuff. So Clark, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Morlich, because of Artemis cult, First Timothy 2:12-15 only rebuking female false teachers, i.e. Adam came before Eve, not Artemis before Apollo, and Christ will save from childbearing, not Artemis. Is this legit?
So I've got my Bible here, Derek, so need to turn to that. 1 Timothy 2:12-15. I was just sure that, let's see, who is it? Clark was going to ask about 3:16-18.
Right.
That little embedded confession. But he's not doing that.
I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet.
The standard, and frankly, most scholars don't think that the so-called pastorals, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, are from Paul directly, although they could have Pauline material in them. And the standard commentaries go almost ad nauseum over all the different possibilities. But I'm trying to get the sense here of Clark's question.
He's doing Artemis before Apollo. I think he's trying to equate it. Would you make a reference to Artemis and Apollo?
I don't know that these kinds of my guess would be, and this is just a guess, is that these kinds of statements are probably built upon a kind of an exegesis of the Hebrew Bible. They go back actually before some of the Greek mythology of the Hellenistic period. For example, he says the reason the woman is to learn in silence, because Adam was formed first and then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, which is actually problematic, as you know, in the Genesis text. But
that's their interpretation of it,
so
right?
It sounds like the author, and I'm just going to say the author, Timothy or whoever, I don't think it's Timothy. It sounds like someone is trying to reinforce, I would say, a backlash against the earlier Paul, who wants to say that in Christ, male, female, bond free, and Jew Gentile, which are gender, social, and economic divisions, are kind of dissolved. And then, as you know, as I argue in an extensive chapter in my book, Paul and Jesus, I got to add already, not yet. So what's happening is Paul kind of wants the free jamboree, where everybody's together. You see Romans and Greeks and Gentiles and Jews, and they're all meeting in harmony. And then you come to 1 Corinthians, and you get into the nitty gritty in chapter 12, 13, 14, where he's actually talking about them meeting together, when you come together. And they're just completely divided up. And then that bizarre thing in chapter 11 earlier about women and their hair, I think it's actually their hair. And Timothy also has that thing about you can't put your hair up and put pearls and things in it, because then you're going to look like an elegant Roman woman, and also your ears and neck will show, which is sexual. And as a modest woman needs to cover her head with her hair, and particularly not have the neck showing, which is considered just like ankles were. If you go back to the 18th and 19th century, if a woman got out of a carriage and showed a little bit of that ankle, guys were like fainting on the sidewalk. And I think you've seen these portraits of Roman women, and they have their hair up, and these classic portraits, particularly from Pompeii, the wooden paintings that we get, and some in Egypt. And I think Paul's just like, no, you can't go that far. Don't look like that.
So to be technical, there is an engagement with the pagan world, but you're not connecting Artemis with Apollo. You're saying, sure, don't imitate this Greco-Roman world lifestyle, but it's pulling from like a Hebraic worldview to try and answer that question, and also includes, well, she'll be saved through having kids, which seems like I had Dr. Litwell on last night, and
the kid, as you know, it could say, or he's being generic here, women,
right?
Like Eve is mother of the gender, and it can be translated and understood, and some have understood it. She'll be saved through bearing the child, meaning as Eve brought sin into the world, and Paul does like this kind of thing, then there's a second Adam that he equates with Jesus, and then there's a second Eve, would essentially be Mary, the mother of Jesus, so that now the remedy for sin is also coming through a woman. So even though she's deceived and led to Adam's fall or his transgression, I actually don't think it's a fall, but we could talk about that too. I think the fall of Adam is a theological Christian misnomer, but woman will be saved through childbearing or through the birth of the child, maybe referring to Jesus. I don't think it has much to do with Paul. although Paul struggled with this issue. And I'm thinking the author is primarily thinking about, as he says in this passage, everybody could pray, but the men are the ones that are to take the lead. And this is what's going on in the synagogues as well, throughout the diaspora. And the book is probably addressing people scattered abroad in Paul's churches. But definitely,
can I
Paul
tell you what I
thinks,
was thinking, just to get your thoughts? So Litwell was mentioning Timothy's probably 2nd century. It's a late forgery in the name of Paul. And he's thinking this, you know how there's ascetics that are in the Gnostic groups that are going on, and they're trying to get people to not have sex, not have kids. There also seems to be Gnostics seem to praise women and have them in positions of power, potentially running. They can be in positions that men weren't. So he is, I think, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he thinks there might be this idea of, look, women, you want to be saved, childbearing is the way to go. Don't be ascetic. Don't run away from sex. You need to have children with your husband. You need to be obedient and subservient to your husband. You need to do these things because just like in the beginning, you fell and you need to follow your husband, that kind of idea, which is more like a political 2nd century patriarchal type of Christianity that's trying to stamp out Gnostic ideas. That could make sense too, right?
It could. And lots of scholars have argued that strain of Christianity, if you want to call it Christianity, that representation of the Jesus movement was actually early on.
Right.
And the women were then kind of shut up, and that the Gnostics are actually reviving that. And that's why Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, are so prominent in some of these texts, like the Nag Hammadi texts.
Wow.
So I don't think I answered the question very well, but I will say this. I don't think that the author is referring to the birth of the child. I think he's just saying childbearing, because again, I think it all comes from a reading of Genesis 2 and 3. And what is the woman told? Your desire will be to your husband. He will rule over you. And in labor, you will bring forth children. It actually doesn't say pain. It actually says labor. And it's the same word used for Adam tilling the soil. So it's not so much pain, but this is your role. Your role is to have babies. And the role of the male is to be out and be a leader in the culture. We're basically talking about 1950s American culture. It was all set up with probably my parents.
I'm glad you added in. This is a little dated, everybody. Yeah. So, all right, next one. Doc Pleuromenot, and he always brings in something that just I can't pronounce half the words. Hopefully, he's taking it easy on me as I take it tough on you. Doc Pleuromenot, thank you for the super chat, and I really appreciate it. Speaking of which, messianic rule says bread comes first, followed by wine. Might the historical Jesus have been enacting not a Passover meal, but his own version of the Qumran's messianic banquet?
Great question, Doc. I love it. Because, first of all, your might agrees with my view. Yes. The answer is yes. I don't think the so-called Lord's Supper is a Passover meal in any way.
Just so everybody knows, he's got a lawnmower running in the background, or weed eater, so don't mind the noise.
It's actually, you're hearing it now?
I heard something.
That's the leaf blower guys across the street. The lawnmower, apparently we didn't hear, but now they're doing that. I hope it's okay. If we're going to go on either way, just turn me up. So anyway, Doc, I think you're exactly right that the Messianic rule, this is for people who don't know, in the Qumran text, we got the main, what we call the community rule that was in Cave 1, but we've also got this fragment that talks about the banquet when the Messiah does come, and the priest and they all gather together in ranks and celebrate this meal. And I think that fits much better historically with the chronology as well of Holy Week. Now, you have to trust to some degree the accounts in the Gospel of John and the Synoptics and try to sort through that. But in that blog post that you highlighted at the beginning of the show that lists all of the different articles, One of them is, did Jesus eat a Passover meal? And what I argue in that post is that he did not, that it was an anticipatory meal. And notice, at least according to the accounts in the Synoptics and John, here they agree, there aren't any women present. It doesn't sound like a family gathering. The most family gathering of Judaism is this coming Friday night, the Seder, as it's called. And of course, it's changed over the years. But the idea that the whole family sits together for the Passover. And that's not the idea that you get in any of our accounts of what Paul calls, and this would be the earliest reference, on the night he was betrayed. So that should be the tag for the night. It shouldn't be Passover. It's the night Jesus was betrayed, according to the accounts, where he had this final meal. And the thing that really tags it is there's language of anticipation embedded within the text. Why do you eat this bread and drink this cup? Because you're going to do it in the kingdom to come. And at least in the earliest source, which I think is reflected in some of the Q material, we don't have to use the word Q if anybody wants to talk about Q. Let's say the material that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark, okay? That material, which tends to be the earliest in the Synoptic Gospels, you know what Jesus says on that night? And this is just in Luke. He says, you're going to sit on 12 thrones ruling the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the Council of 12 that Qumran also talks about, having that the teacher, and he has the inner Council of 12. Now, I don't think the Jesus movement is the Qumran movement. I don't go with barbateering. And even Eisenman, in some ways, I know him really well. He doesn't say it's one-on-one equated. He just thinks that the piety and a lot of the approaches to how to be religious that you find in Qumran are best understood, or the Jesus movement, rather, is best understood in that light. So anyway, if you reconstruct it as the night he's betrayed, it's the farewell meal. It's the last meal. This is the meal where you say, I'm leaving, I'm departing, but I'll see you in the kingdom of God. And, you know, depending on how much you want to go with the accounts, does he anticipate his arrest, his possible crucifixion and demise, but he believes God will raise him up? It's that kind of a meal. And there's that sense of sorrow and a parting, completely opposite from Passover. Passover is rejoicing in redemption, and it's celebrating victory. So lots of Christians today, do you know that they meet on Passover night and they try to reenact the Lord's Supper as if it's Passover? And they come up with these, I shouldn't say crazy, but I will. I think crazy ideas like, why's the matzah got all those marks on it? Those are the stripes of Jesus when he was beaten. You know, things like this. It's just, you know, unleavened bread has nothing to do with beating Jesus, believe me. It's the bread of haste. It's the bread that you make when you're in a hurry to leave. And, you know, that goes all of that way back, even before the Exodus. Do you remember in the story of Lot, when he flees Sodom and Gomorrah, it says that his wife hurried and baked unleavened bread. It's like, you got to leave in 15 minutes. Well, I
never noticed that.
Yeah, my bread's rising. Throw it in that oven and, you know, grab it because we're running. So it's the bread of haste. So anyway, I really agree with you, Doc, and I think there are quite a few other parallels. As far as that Last Supper meal, you know, people that have read my stuff know, and there's also an article on that same blog post. Did Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, say, eat my body, drink my blood? And I absolutely do not think he said anything like that.
Right.
Jesus, the historical Jesus.
Right.
And the earliest account is Paul. And then the synoptics follow Paul. But you know, Derek, that we have another document. We refer to it as the Didache, not, usually we say didache. I hear people say didache, but it's the teaching. Didache is teaching in Greek. And it's was discovered at the end of the 19th century in the 1800s in a monastery. And it does have an account of the sacred meal, and it sounds very much like the Messianic banquet. If your readers have not looked that up, it's online. You can find the Didache even just by Googling Didache. And it turns out that the bread is celebrating the kingdom of God, and the wine is celebrating the joy that you experience in the kingdom of God. So I really do think that you're on track with that question.
Okay, I'm posting that just so everybody has, if you wanted to search earlychristianwritings.com has it. We have 8 other super chats, so we're going to try and catch up with this.
I'll try to be succinct in my answers.
No, you're fine. I love these. I'm pushing on because you and me, we can blah, 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 and then we get lost, and there's a lot of people with questions. So Doc Plormonat is back again. Tack on to question 1. Could the healed bent woman in Luke refer to as daughter of Abraham, like the heroine in Maccabees, be a redefined egalitarian advocacy for motherhood? Could the healed bent woman in Luke, referred to as the daughter of Abraham, like the heroine in Maccabees, be redefined? Yeah.
I haven't actually thought of that story in that regard, but I've thought of other texts that might point to that sort of thing. And some of them are even in the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, I wrote a book on Mary. It's not coming out until a year from now, called The Lost Mary. It's on Mary, the mother of Jesus. And one of the chapters in that book talks about the places within the Hebrew Bible, within Maccabees, even within the New Testament, where women are actually given this matriarchal role. So, for example, in the Torah, this is often overlooked. It's a Torah reading that is read every year in the synagogue. A woman seeds seed. And so the idea biologically is that a woman ovulates, she puts out a seed, and then the male seed joins with the female seed. And so, as you know, in the Middle Ages and all the way through until we began to get a more scientific approach to anatomy, the thought was that the woman is just an empty shell that provides a place for the baby to grow. Right. So I know this is about birth and conception and pregnancy, but this idea that what he calls motherhood, a more egalitarian view of motherhood, I think you can find embedded in these texts. Now, I haven't thought of that one as possibly being like that. Of course, you have the heroine in Second Maccabees with those horrible murder stories, right? But they're here and there. It's like little scattered breadcrumbs throughout these traditions. You get women who surface and become leaders. And I would argue that that's going on in the Jesus movement.
Okay, next one. Stop Scamming Man. Thank you for the super chat. Now, I'm going to throw my idea out here right before you get an answer in. I just want to get your thoughts to see what you think versus maybe what I have to say, because you've read this a million times. I've only read this 500,000. Stop Scamming Man. To me, the story of Judas betraying Jesus for money doesn't seem very meaningful. Any thoughts as to why it would be claimed? Because it was true? Another way of showing his disciples could suck? I personally see the Judas thing, and this is the only confusing part, is if you try to equivocate Paul's reference to say the night he was betrayed, if you try to say that means that was Judas, that would be the only problem. But even Bart Ehrman recently published saying he doesn't think that's a reference to Judas. But Judas seems more like a literary Hebrew from the Joseph story of Judah betraying Joseph for the shekels of silver, just like Judas is betraying for the shekels of silver. Seems more of a literary device, not necessarily. I'm not saying there isn't possibly possibly something behind it, like one of his close friends helped rat him out or something in reality. But this is highly fictional, in my opinion, and a literary invention rather than history. But what do you think? Why? The question is, any thoughts as to why it would be claimed that he sold Jesus out because it was true, or another way of showing his disciples could suck?
Judas Iscariot, of course, he's always mentioned last in the 5 different lists of the 12 that we have. I think probably there is a strong tradition that there are 2 disciples with the name Judas. It's a common name. But as far as what he did as the betrayer, that seems to be imposed upon the story later. And I think I would tend to go with you on that. As you know, and maybe this is what Bart said, the word betrayed, paradidomai, is really handed over. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily imply anything other than the night he was arrested, presumably in Gethsemane. And so this idea of betrayal is read back in from Paul. But the earliest reference to the night he was betrayed would be like the night he was delivered up and arrested and crucified. That's the tradition that Paul knows, that he died, that he was buried, that he was raised, and so forth. He's got this sort of sequence, the weekend sequence in the tradition that he's received. So I would go with you on that. And I like the Joseph thing. I've thought of that. The other thing is in Zechariah, you get this very mysterious and strange passage about selling me for 30 pieces of silver and that kind of thing. And you can see how that could be combined with the Genesis text, which is then combined with somebody betraying.
Can I throw one more thing at you?
But I would think MacDonald must have lots of stories about betrayal in classical literature.
That's a good point.
Wouldn't you? I mean, maybe
I'm sure he does. Yeah.
Well, first of all, let's go back to Doc. I don't need to go to classical literature. Who is the man of the lie in the Qumran community? He's called the man of the lie. Why is he the man of the lie? Did you know in the scrolls it says, the one, my familiar friend who ate with me, has lifted up his heel against me, which is a quotation from the Psalms, but that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls about this guy, unnamed, who betrays the teacher of righteousness. And he goes off and leads a dissident community during the lifetime of the teacher. And the Gospels also quote that same quote, put it in the mouth of Jesus on the night he was betrayed or delivered over, where he says, the one who dips his bread in the bowl with me is the one who's lifted up his heel against me. So talk about history repeating itself. I put the Dead Sea Scroll movement at least 100 years before the time of Jesus. Some put it even earlier than that. And there's a Judas.
Yeah.
So Judas has become in our culture even today, I mean, he's just the proverbial betrayer.
This is a very interesting point because there's always friction in movements like this, debates, arguments and stuff, and it's probably easily someone would flip-flop and that person could be used as in the way you're describing. But I wanted to throw one more thing to see if it sticks before we leave. Joseph gets sold, ends up in Potiphar's house, ends up running out of the house butt naked because the wife wanted to try and, take advantage of him. He ends up in prison, and he's the overseer, technically. The story kind of has this picture like he raised to like the top of the prison, and they kind of have him as this important figure in prison, but nonetheless, he's stuck in prison. 2 men have dreams. They each have dreams with certain images, and of course, he tells them to tell him his dream, and he interprets it. And how does he interpret it? In 3 days, Mr. Baker, notice something, the baker, the bread, okay? In 3 days, you're going to be head decapitated. Birds are going to eat the flesh off of your skin. The other wine bearer, he says, in 3 days, you will be back up with Pharaoh, back in his household, serving wine. Everything's going to be fine. And in 3 days, each man went exactly where he predicted according to the story. As he's leaving the chamber, he says to the wine bearer, don't forget about me. Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Okay. I cannot imagine that this is not a literary trope. I've looked at this over and over. There's 3 days. There's the wine and the bread. The whole Eucharist is kind of right there in Joseph's story. And don't forget about me. Try to remember me, recollect me. I can't see that not playing a role in what's going on in the gospel narratives. What do you think?
I haven't thought of it, but I'll think about it. Yeah,
I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I have to wonder whether it's one thing. Remember, the earliest account is Paul,
right?
And he took bread first, and he took wine, but then he interprets it, of course, as the body and the blood of Jesus, which I just don't imagine took place on the night he was betrayed in exactly those words of institution, as they're often called. I would go more at the Didache. So I don't know, since you have the Dead Sea Scrolls and since you have the Messianic banquet idea embedded in Jewish culture, I think it's out there. But the specificity you point to about these exact elements, and particularly the 3 days, is something to think about. We do know that these things are just kind of swirling around.
Right.
You got constant doublets and even triplets in the book of Genesis. I heard you talk about that recently.
Yes, sir.
Two stories of this and 3 stories of this. And so you get that. You also get the Jonah story. The 3 days. Have you ever noticed that Abraham, when he offers Isaac on the mountain, there's also it's a 3-day thing?
I did not notice that.
It's in there. Jonah and the fish is 3 days.
That's cool.
Hosea chapter 6. You're going to be wounded and die, and then after 3 days you'll be raised up. So this 3-day motif is just something within the culture. Usually people say, oh, it just means a short time. I think it means more than that. Otherwise you say, well, like next day. I think there's something also, as I recall, with Esther, in the book of Esther. I believe that's also 3 days.
There's just a lot of this, yeah.
A lot of those 3-day periods. So, it could be what you're referring to could be there. So.
Thank you. Moving on to Stop Scamming Man. Do you think Jesus' teachings were influenced by Hillel the elder? And thank you for the support, my friend.
So, Stop Scamming. I like your name. we need to be against that scamming. So,
right.
There's all kinds of scamming in our world, isn't there? I almost want to say it's in the air. We don't have a lot on Hillel. We have isolated sayings. The most famous story of Hillel is when a Gentile comes to him and to his rival Shammai, who's very conservative. These are 2 Pharisees. And he says, can you teach me the Torah while I'm standing on 1 foot? The Gentile doesn't have a lot of time. He's checking his watch. And he figures it's just an expression, but the idea is, how long can you stand on 1 foot? I want it quick. Like, give me the quick version. And Shammai drives him away and beats him with sticks because he's not really worthy of receiving the deep knowledge of Judaism if he wants the Cliff Note version or even just a page of Cliff Notes. I don't even want to read the Cliff Note book. That's too long. He goes to Hillel, and Hillel says, sure, I'll do that. Whatever is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow human being, fellow man, your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go learn. And that's does remind you of Jesus in Mark 12, where he's asked, what is the great commandment? And there's a wise scribe. By the way, Luke takes the guy out, and Matthew makes him not wise at all and has Jesus more or less telling him. But Mark preserves the wisdom of the guy. He's the only guy praised in the whole Gospel of Mark for having any understanding. And what Jesus says to the guy, after he says this, teacher, you are right. If you love God and love your fellow human being as yourself, that would be more than all of this. And he points, you picture him going like this. They're in Herod's temple in the courtyard. That would be more than all of these burnt offering, sacrifice, everything we're doing. Jesus says, you're not far from the kingdom of God. That's a Hillel thing. You see what he's saying? He's basically saying, do you even need the temple? Do you remember in Jeremiah 6, Jeremiah is talking about the Babylonian invasion and the first temple going down. And he says, God, when he brought Israel out of Egypt, did not even tell them to offer sacrifices and offerings. That was like imposed later because of the golden calf incident and all
I
of
don't even know if I made that video that you and I did on this public. I think it's still on my Patreon because
Is it in there? Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the two threads that run throughout the Bible: pro priestly, which is pro sacrifice, bring your money to the temple, cha-ching, cha-ching, and the other side that's saying, like, no, I didn't even want to sacrifice. I wanted you to be a good person. I wanted, so that this is there's a whole lot behind that, but I'm going to keep pressing forward because we have so much more to go into.
Let me say one more thing on Hillel, though, just to add this. I only quoted the one teaching, and it is maybe his main one. But also, you get the idea from many, many Bible readers, Christians reading the New Testament, that the Pharisees were the strict group, and they were very rigid, and they oppressed the people, because that's particularly if you have Matthew later. But in fact, Hillel represents the leadership of the Pharisees, and the whole idea is to make the religion possible to observe with certain kinds of circumlocutions and adjustments for human need. Like, can you go out of your house on the Sabbath? Torah says no. Well, maybe we could redefine house as not the 4 rooms you live in, but maybe your city, and they would do things like that. So they've gotten a bad rap, the poor Pharisees, where now it's even a dictionary entry. To call someone a Pharisee means they're like this mindless, heartless hypocrite who cares of nothing but legalities. And that's not even what the Pharisees were all about.
Yeah, the New Testament has made an impact even on the word for Jews. I mean, look, Christ killers becomes equivocal to, you know what I mean? It's like, whoa. Like, no. So that's an interesting point you bring up. Christians I hear all the time, oh, you're just a legalistic Pharisee. And it's like, whoa. Moving on. Omar Al-Yafai. I'm saying that probably wrong, so please forgive me. Hey, Dr. Tabor, do you think it's appropriate to put Jesus in the Palestinian Jewish or Mediterranean pagan frame? Depending who you ask, I get different scholarly answers. Thank you.
Okay, this is the big debate, Athens or Jerusalem, right? And I studied at the University of Chicago with Jonathan Z. Smith, the great scholar of Hellenistic religions who died a few years ago. And he is just, I think, acknowledged by all of us in the history of religions as being the master. And the point that he would always make kind of skirts the question or undermines the assumption of the question and even the discussion. And I don't mean Omar's question, but how he's been jerked back and forth from, was he more Palestinian Jewish or was he more Greco-Roman pagan, so-called? These are all loaded terms, of course. Every one of those terms is very loaded. And what Smith argued, Jonathan Smith, and most of us that work in the field of Hellenistic religions, I think, accept this as our primary premise, and that is that all the religions of the Hellenistic period are Hellenized already. So get rid of the word pagan and then ask, is there a form of Judaism that is not already being Hellenized? And then you've got to talk about what is Hellenization. But essentially it means accepting the cosmos, the worldview of the Hellenistic age, accepting the view of death and afterlife with either the immortal soul, resurrection of the dead. Everybody goes that way. So that Judaism, as it develops out of the Second Temple period, becomes a kind of a dualistic Jewish version of Hellenistic piety. And so I think the lines get more and more blurred and finally kind of disappear. And I think pagan and Jewish can be very loaded terms. You have to kind of define what you mean by those. I do have a book, just to push a book that I haven't talked about. Paul's Ascent to Paradise here. This is Paul as a Hellenistic religious figure and thinker within this Jewish, Christian, in triple quotes, context. Because, what do you mean by Christian? Pagan is a word, but the point is, what kind of cosmos did Paul operate in? Is he in the ancient Near Eastern culture of the Hebrew Bible, or has he entered the Hellenistic world of angels, principalities, powers, demons, evil spirits, Satan, levels of heaven? You see the idea? And I would say that, why do you have zodiacs on the synagogue floors throughout the diaspora? Why do you have all of the accoutrements of a Hellenistic understanding of the world, even among Jews during this time?
Thank you so much. Yeah. I also posted, just so everybody knows, his book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise. And it is a fantastic read. If you haven't read him, Paul and Jesus, just get his books on Audible if you can't read it in the text. There's just a lot of great stuff. Susie Bailey, thank you so much for the super sticker. I really appreciate the love, and you always come through. I was looking for a question. Don't see one. Did someone block Den Lions? Seems like they're triggered. Poor people. Graders, thank you so much for the super chat. There are many important Byzantine archaeological sites in the Levant. Was the main Byzantine building spree in the Levant in the 4th century with Constantine, or in the 6th century with Justinian? Uh-oh.
It's not my field, but I'll take a guess because I do archaeology and have excavated Byzantine remains in Jerusalem. I've been digging on Mount Zion with Shimon Gibson now for 15 years. And we started at the modern level, literally cigarette butts and, Coke bottle cans on the ground, and took it all the way down to the Iron Age. So we've seen that progression of civilization, at least around the city of Jerusalem, which has all the periods of habitation. The problem with the 4th century is the earthquake of 363, where so much was leveled and then rebuilt. And when they rebuild in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, where there is quite a revival, particularly in the Levant, and I'm even more familiar with Jerusalem and the Holy Land, they use the former Byzantine foundations. A perfect example that relates to this very week is that Church of the Apostles, as it's called on Mount Zion, that some have traced back to foundations of the 1st century because of graffiti on the floor at that level. Then it clearly has a 4th century Church of Mary, and then it gets destroyed and then rebuilt again. And yet they keep basically the formation of the building, and particularly the foundations. But I would say that the 6th century is where you really see the revival. But again, I often tell my students, I go from the Maccabees to the Mishnah, and then I kind of run out of steam.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
But because I've been around my colleagues that work in that period, that would be my sense of things.
Thank you so much for that. Endo, thoughts on the arsenicoitai? Does the New Testament condemn LGBT?
Oh, wow. Okay, this is a terms that are used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6. And I think because of Romans 1 and what Paul talks about in terms of men with men and women with women and so forth, he clearly thinks that the sort of social practice of what people are now calling same-sex relationships is sinful or horrible. But he also thinks, see, when people read Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians 6, they tend to just go to the same-sex kind of references, and then they forget that right before that is adultery and fornication and all the other kinds of sexual sins.
Right.
According to Paul, you see. So why would we ask, does he condemn immoral same-sex sex without asking, does he condemn what he calls immoral heterosexual relationships? Right. You see my point?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking it's hard to get into his head, but it is very possible, as some exegetes have argued, that he's talking about the abuse of sexuality. He's talking not so much about is it same sex or is it heterosexual, but what sort of power relationships are present. So that could be a man oppressing a woman. It could be a man being unfaithful to a woman, or a woman being unfaithful to a man, and so forth. And when Paul does in the next chapter address that, he says, don't stay apart because of temptations to immorality. Like if you do separate because you have problems getting along with your marriage. But I don't think we need to make Paul a modern person with 21st century sensibilities. My guess is he's probably not that. But we have to remind ourselves that other than Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, is it 5 or 6 where these words occur? I think it's 6.
I'd have to look it up.
I think it's 6, yeah. Other than those passages, what is there in the Gospels? Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. And what is there in the entire Hebrew Bible? Except for don't spill your seed with a man.
Well, I thought, isn't that in Leviticus?
Could have to do with procreation and people deciding they're not going to, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It's not as though people act like the Bible's some kind of a primer on all kinds of sexuality and what is allowed and not allowed. And really, it uses terms like don't adulterate, don't fornicate, and fornicate means to sell or to be cheap. It's actually going more for, if you break those terms down, they're more about the abuse and cheapening of sexuality. Well, then people would have to define what that would involve in a given situation.
Interesting.
So, does that help? Just to,
I think to put it simply, Paul would not be running around with a rainbow flag personally. Obviously, I don't think he would.
No.
But we're in a different time today, and people are realizing things that maybe they didn't quite realize then. So, yeah. Thank you. Stop scamming, man. Thank you for the super chat. Some seem to think Christianity in Paul's time was very small. Yet Tacitus speaks of Claudius expelling Rome's Jews for anti-Christian riots. How Mr. Josephus wrote of James, and the way you spelled that's funny, wrote of James' death implies significance. Was it that small? Do I need to reread this better?
No, I think I got it.
Okay.
And not only James's death, but John the Baptist, he says that Herod arrested him because he was afraid that he would have a wide following among the people. And with John the Baptist even. So that might even be stronger than James. It's really hard to put any kind of numbers on this, and you have to talk about the homeland and the diaspora. And Josephus, even though he goes to Rome, is talking about figures like James, John the Baptist, and if he does mention Jesus in the homeland, during the first century before the revolt. My own sense is I think if you would ask Brother Bart down the road from me, I'm at Charlotte, he's at Chapel Hill, he would tend to go the opposite with what I would go with on a number of these things that are related. Jesus is poor, he's illiterate, he's insignificant, doesn't hardly have any followers, and it all became great later and was blown up and rewritten. He has great crowds following him. I would tend to go the other way with this. That is, Jesus is one of the more prominent messianic, I'm going to call them pretenders or claimants. Let's say claimants. I have a YouTube video that's kind of gone viral called Dead Messiahs Who Don't Return. And it's basically making the simple point that what happens to every Messiah in the first century, and we can probably come up with a list of 15 of them, And I'm using Messiah in a very limited sense, meaning anointed ones who thought they were the one and they're going to bring the redemption. They're going to fulfill Jewish hopes and dreams and get the Romans removed from the country. What happens to every one of them? They get killed. Now, some of the more prominent ones, like Judas the Galilean, apparently has a significant enough following to break into the city of Sepphoris and raid the armory and raise enough of a problem that 3 legions are sent down at the death of Herod to put down the revolts that broke out all over the country. So I would tend to see Jesus as much more influential in his own time and as leading a movement that was quite a threat and quite significant. And so it's just, these things, so many of the things in early Christianity, unfortunately, we come down to almost like a sense that we get and want to put forth. And that is my sense, that given the times, given the tinderbox that Judea, Samaria, and the Galilee were, for Jesus as a healer and an exorcist and a proclaimer of the kingdom of God, and also a disruptor of social order with his egalitarian ideas, that he's going to cause a stir, a significant stir. But I would say here, like Eisenman would say about James, the brother of Jesus, maybe look at John the Baptist and James as much as Jesus, and then talk about the messianic movement in Palestine, as he calls it, that actually goes from the Dead Sea Scrolls on up to Bar Kokhba. And did that have very significant wave after wave after wave as various leaders came along who claimed to be somebody? I think it was a huge problem for the Romans for over 100 years. These guys weren't don't think of them as a guy in Manhattan with the board sign on going, the end is near, and people walk by and go, who's that crazy guy? I don't think it was like that. I think there's enough of a context to base a movement. And if he did choose his council of 12, you realize that's a government in exile? He's essentially putting his cabinet together to take over and rule the country, which he expects to do.
I want everybody to know I did post a link to the video he's talking about, the dead messiahs who don't return. It's a lecture that he gives presentation. There's going to be visuals, all that nice stuff in there, as you can see. So consider going over there and subscribing and watching the video. All right, moving on. Jake K. Thank you, Jake, for the super chat or super sticker. Sorry. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. Johnson Pike, thank you again to see you here and for the super chat. Jude 1:14-15 is explicit. But was Enoch treated like scripture for other first century Christian writers?
Well, that's certainly a significant observation. Not many of our fellow Christians seem to recognize it, or they would go get a copy of Enoch and maybe start reading it. Of course, we have Ethiopian Enoch that has 5 parts to it. But if you just go to the first section of Enoch, that's where this is quoted from. It's very significant. And I can't see how it would not be significant to other followers of Jesus and to the Jesus movement as well. And that's not simply supposition. I'll tell you, the person who does maybe the best job on this classically is R.H. Charles. When he publishes his book, The Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, which was one of the earliest translations of Ethiopic Enoch, I think it was 1912. It's online, by the way. You can get it free if you Google it. R.H. Charles. He includes within his evaluation of Enoch several hundred parallels in words, vocabulary, language, and phrases that are not a quote like Jude, but just allusions and assumptions that are made so that you could talk about, as several Dead Sea Scroll scholars do, Enochian Judaism. That have you heard that term before, Derek? Enochian Judaism. Boccaccini is the one who maybe coined it, Gabriella. But it's the idea that there's a whole variety of Judaism in the late Second Temple period. A more Gnosticizing, mystical, dualistic kind that would be more Enochian that we also find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the influence of that literature and that worldview is just extremely strong, even though this might be the only direct quote that we have. But it shows that it's out there and floating around. And the writer of Jude has no hesitation in quoting it. And he seems to think Enoch wrote it, which is really a stretch. So,
yeah, anyone who's looked into that, I just posted the link to R.H. Charles' Enoch Amazon book for anybody who's interested in getting it. I remember reading a translation of the Book of Enoch, 1 Enoch, and it might have been all 5 books, but specifically 1 Enoch is what I was focusing on. And the commentator, the person who's doing the translation, was commentating and was saying, I think they found 48 to 50. So maybe this is R.H. Charles, and he's how old is R.H. Charles? Is this
1912? Yeah.
Okay, yes. Then this has to be, because it was literally showing you the reference points.
Yeah, it's in columns across.
Yes.
New Testament, Enoch. New Testament, Enoch.
I remember reading that like maybe 6 years ago, and I was blown away, going, "Whoa, maybe there's more going on than I realized inside of the New Testament." So definitely get it if you haven't. Go read it. I think there's free versions online. I hate to say that, but I definitely would Google it.
It is in the public domain now, and it has been scanned, so you can get it.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I watched. I read it for free. So definitely check that out. Johnson, thank you so much for that super chat. Moving on to the next one here. Hope everybody's having fun. Oh, Gnostic informant, Neil in the house. Dr. James Tabor is an authority when it comes to all things Israel, from Maccabees to Bar Kokhba, however you want to pronounce that. So, thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
Really do appreciate it. Neil will be with us in Israel too in October. So I hope to scare the crap out of him in the Hezekiah's tunnel when we're filming. I told him I
was thinking of pushing him off the cliff at Nazareth, because I think he's a little skeptical that Nazareth existed, and certainly not the cliff. So he'll need a parachute, but if we have time, we could run up the cliff at Nazareth and see if Neil wants to jump off. So.
He should jump off the pinnacle of one of the local buildings, and the angel should be, should catch him, right? And help him out. Looking forward to it for sure. Neil, appreciate you, man. Thank you for the support, brother. Indo's back. Can you speak on Ehrman's view of Jesus not having a proper burial? Why would Pilate release Barabbas? What did early Christian skeptics think?
Yeah, I can speak on that. I've also written a book on it.
I know you definitely disagree with Ehrman on this. So
yeah. The idea that he was left on the cross and the dogs ate him or anything like that, I think that would cause such unrest at Passover. It would be the last. I know Pontius Pilate is noted to be very cruel and vicious, but he's also been told by the emperor Tiberius, or actually, I think probably more Sejanus. Remember, Sejanus is running the empire during this period, and I think he's been told to cool it, so to speak. We don't want a full-scale revolt on our Parthian border. This is the worry that the Romans have, because the Parthians have invaded before, and they've gotten all the way into Jerusalem, remember, under Hyrcanus. And so that's what they're really worried about. So you want to keep things peaceful. But beyond that, I just think Paul's passing statement, which is our earliest reference, that Jesus died and was buried and raised and seen, his little formula. It's just the normal pattern that he had received, as he says, and that he'd heard, and I think the burial is just part of it. It's not the burial that's so much of a surprise as how do you account for the empty tomb? And I've argued, not trying to be so historical with the empty tomb, but more with the burial, that the initial burial was near the place of crucifixion, according to our accounts. And it's a burial of convenience and emergency. It's not like somebody named Joseph of Arimathea happened to have a family tomb right near the gate where the Romans slaughtered people regularly by the thousands. And you say, by the thousand? Yeah, 500 a day during the Jewish revolt. But 2,000 are mentioned as being crucified after the revolt of Judas the Galilean. So the Mount of Olives and that whole area around the north and east of Jerusalem is crucifixion city, you know. And I don't think Joseph of Arimathea or whoever took the body, whether it's Joseph or not, had a family tomb right there nearby. So what do you do on Passover night? Remember, he doesn't eat Passover, but Passover is at sundown. And so what do you do? I'm accepting the basic framework of the narratives that we have to work with. You have to put the body in an unused tomb and block it up so that the jackals don't chew on it over the holiday. And then at the earliest you can get there, you go and rebury the body permanently. And I think that's what happened. And if it is Joseph of Arimathea, which all of our accounts, credit with taking charge of the burial. I know Bart thinks he's a fictional character. Maybe he is. But somebody took the body. Now, here's the thing, Derek. I want to make the point. All the people that say Jesus is buried at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, including my Jewish archaeological friends, I won't name them, but there's a dozen of my Jewish friends who don't believe in the resurrection, but they're absolutely sure the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the place of Jesus' burial. And I think it's on the Mount of Olives. And, I also, that blog post again has a link to that, where was Jesus crucified? But anyway, I was at a conference a few years ago, and one of these archaeologists said, Tabor has his alternative site, but I think it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So I just said, I don't want to be cute here, and I don't want to be cavalier, but that tomb's empty, isn't it? And you don't think he was raised from the dead. So he was buried, but he's not there. Finish, please. I assume he was buried in an emergency and then reburied somewhere permanently. And
let me ask you this.
You get the point, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You would imagine if they did have his body.
You may have a point there, meaning that he could be buried anywhere in Jerusalem because that would be the permanent burial that someone took charge of in terms of a family. Now, I want to say this, too, real quick. Dale said this, and I had never heard him say it, Dale Allison. You know what the most authentic sounding account of the visit to the empty tomb is? John 20, 1 through 10. But you got to stop at verse 10 because then all the legend and mythology starts. And what do you have? You have exactly what one would expect. He's stashed temporarily, I think Thursday, but go with Friday. I don't really care what day of the week. He's stashed temporarily right after the crucifixion. As soon as the festival allows it, Mary Magdalene goes early Sunday morning, according to all of our accounts, and she says, they've taken him already. Where did they move him? See the idea? Mm-hmm. I'm going to go and finish anointing the body because we couldn't finish on the day of the crucifixion, Thursday or Friday, and he's gone. And if you stop right there, that just sounds exactly like what you would expect. You go to finish and the body's gone. And then you have to decide, well, how did the body get removed?
That's where I wanted to ask you to comment on this. I'm going to play a clip real quick. It's only 60 seconds. I made it recently on my shorts. I'm doing that for YouTube now. Let's see what we have here. I'm going to play it full screen, actually, and take down this. All right, here we go.
If Jesus didn't rise from
Can you hear that?
Really was
yeah.
How loud is that?
Wow.
Look. So
hold on. It's like freezing up for me here.
If Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Do you hear that loud and clear?
I start to hear it, and yet you keep moving it up and down. So
Yeah, it didn't sound like it was loud and clear to me. That's why I was asking.
No,
if
I
you
can
could-
hear it. It starts out, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead or something like that.
Okay, let me do it one more time.
If Jesus didn't rise from the dead and the tomb really was empty, what happened to his body? I'm like, wow, you actually.
Look. So N.T. Wright admits tomb robbery was fairly common in the ancient world. We have a number of inscriptions which are prohibiting people from moving bodies. We have lots of magical papyri where you're supposed to use body parts from people who died violently, right? And you're so if I were a skeptic, I thought the tomb were empty, I would just say that. And by the way, if this were tomb robbers, they're not going to put the stone back in place. They're going to hurry up and they're going to run away. You know, that place in the Gospel of John where the garments are sort of rolled up, you know, in a nice, neat pile. I actually think that's probably an early attempt to say it's not tomb robbers.
If Jesus didn't rise.
All right. So interesting little clip. I thought you might like. I threw it together the other day.
Yeah, I heard that when he gave it. I mean, that's certainly a possibility because if it is a tomb of convenience and emergency, and in the Gospel of John, which is very theological in its dialogues, but the last sections of John have a lot of historical references that I think are valid, like where was the judgment seat of Pilate and that sort of thing. And it does say, because the Sabbath was near, and near the place was this unused tomb, they put him there. Everybody overlooks that and they go, oh, it's Joseph's tomb. It doesn't say it's Joseph's tomb. It says because it was nearby. It's an emergency burial. Now, if the tomb robbery theory is correct or possible, that would be a tomb you would rob because it's not somebody's property. It's like, hey, creep in at night. And you know why they would rob the tomb also is they want to get crucifixion nails. Crucifixion nails are the greatest magical amulet of the Mediterranean world. This is not known by many people. Did you know that rabbis will allow you to carry one thing on the Sabbath? Very strict Pharisaic rabbis. You can carry a crucifixion nail around your neck because it has such magical power to protect you. It's kind of the opposite of good. It was evil, and therefore it can ward off evil. So, you know,
Whoa.
The Romans even kept these nails. And, you know, but sometimes you find them in tombs.
Wow.
So, but I don't think that's likely. I mean, I heard Dale say that. I thought it was interesting. I think the most likely scenario is emergency burial until after the festival, followed by a respectful permanent burial. And by whoever's responsible for carrying out the final burial rites. So,
thank you so much. Doc Plurimonata is back preaching in Antioch of Jesus' enemies. Paul parallels David, who raised up Saul corruption, but Jesus didn't. Acts 13:37. Decay is the Greek use agerion, simply the anastasis of the soma.
Yeah, there's this reference back to the Psalms about your body not seeing corruption. But the problem with that is it's that 3-day thing again. The idea would be 3 to 4 days is the limit. So you got to get the resurrection within that period. Then the body isn't considered to be corrupt. And so I don't know that it actually says much other than he was raised very quickly. And certainly in the book of Acts, that is the view of Luke, or I should say the author of Luke Acts, because I don't think his name was Luke necessarily. And he does present it as a Sunday morning, and they're running around Jerusalem, proclaiming he's risen and seeing him and touching him and eating with him. But these are our latest accounts. And in the earliest accounts, no such thing is happening. People are seeing him on a mountain in the Galilee in Matthew and doubting. Mark doesn't even have any appearances.
Yeah.
So I just think, you know, that's kind of part of Lucan apologetics, is to say he was raised in 3 days, and therefore it means he was really dead, but he didn't rot in Sheol. Almost like you entered the gates of Sheol, like Jonah, but then you can come back out again and be okay. I'm not sure if that addresses it or not, but I hope so.
Hope so, Doc. I hope that helped you out there in terms of your answer you're looking for. Crossover Maniac, did Pilate have any failed messiahs put to death besides Jesus?
I'm trying to think. In Pilate's reign, 26 to 36 traditionally, I don't believe we have names of any, but remember the names Josephus gives. I think he gives 12 to 14, depending on how you define messiahs or revolt leaders or whatever. Josephus calls them brigands, right? They're basically robbers because he doesn't like them. I don't recall any in that period. My guess would be they come and go, but maybe didn't have a significant enough following to get, mentioned. In the year Herod dies, there are 3 in one summer. Herod the Great. You have 3. So, the king was dead, so you had the opportunity of the vacuum. But really, 26 to 36, things are fairly stable. And when I say fairly stable, it's never stable in Judea. But maybe Pilate's able to clamp down a bit. I want to go back to Doc's question for a minute, if you guys don't mind, because it gives me a chance, if nobody's going to ask it, to say that I think Paul's early understanding of the resurrection body is not corpse resuscitation or corpse revival. And I know most of my New Testament colleagues, I believe Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Allison, do feel that there's this continuity between the material body, the body of flesh that corrupts, and the new spiritual body. And I actually don't hold that view. The only reason it even comes up with Jesus is you're talking about a matter of a few days and of an empty tomb, which the apologist writers, Matthew, Luke, and John, then turn into resurrection. But when Paul in general is talking about dead people, he's talking about sleeping in the dust. I don't think he's interested in gathering body parts. The book of Revelation talks about the sea giving up the dead, the ocean.
Right.
I don't think Paul's understanding of resurrection has any physical connection to the body he calls the tent. The place to go for Paul, besides 1 Corinthians 15, which I think is clear enough, but apparently it's not for people who hold this other view. I think it's a holdover from evangelical fundamentalism, frankly. Empty tomb, therefore, must be a body running around. But Mark doesn't say that. Mark thinks the resurrection is essentially the ascension of Jesus. And I think that's the early view. When Jesus is raised, he's raised, you've mentioned the Romulus story, which I like. He sort of rises up and then melts away into the cosmos or something like that. I don't think that's exactly parallel to Jesus' story, because we have no picture of the ascent other than Acts chapter 1, which seems like he's just flesh and blood and just ate a meal and is heading up to heaven with his stomach full, which is really, come on. He had to get transformed as he went up, I guess. But I do think that Paul's view of resurrection is a new creation, and it'll be in a body appropriate to that new existence, that heavenly existence. And he calls it a life-giving spirit. He characterizes it as glorious and so forth. And he thinks the living will also get this same kind of existence. But the place to go is 2 Corinthians 5, where he clearly says the body's a tent or a set of old clothes. He uses both analogies. So it almost sounds like Plato, but it's not Platonism because it's resurrection. So you're in the tent. You, Derek, are in your tent. That's your body. Your tent, you leave your tent. You don't I got to carry this tent with me. I love that tent. That tent's gone. It'll rot. Just leave it aside. Clothing is even better because that's the one that he uses more often, being reclothed. You strip down your clothes, and he explicitly says, not that we would be found naked, but would be further clothed or reclothed, you see. So the naked state is the interim state before the resurrection. The person exists in Sheol or Hades in a kind of shadowy form, but they're not embodied. Embodied means that you're fully active as an agent in the cosmos. You're basically resting in the dust or sleeping in the dust, so to speak. That's the metaphor.
Or Paul's seed analogy, getting rid of the casing of the seed, and the plant that comes forth is not the same as the shell that the seed was. So
I think the caterpillar and the butterfly is pretty good because you actually have a little tomb that you crawl into, the cocoon, or you spin it around yourself. And then, of course, it's obviously a butterfly is not a new spiritual entity, but in terms of it being nothing like the former, it's not a resuscitated caterpillar.
Right.
Comes forth from the tomb. It's
completely transformed. Yeah.
So that kind of is my idea. And I think what the disciples and followers did experience, I call them sightings more than appearances. Their sightings of Jesus was contributed to their belief that he had ascended to heaven and been exalted by God despite his death. I don't think it had anything to do with the body.
So do you think, just to press it further real quick before we move forward to the next one, because we've got a few more super chats before we end this episode, do you think that their sightings, their visions that they have of Jesus are like, I'm looking up and they see something in the sky and they think that's a sign to them? This is the problem I had. I want to say I was on Acts 17 Apologetics. David Wood, my friend Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. I'm the only skeptic on here who doesn't believe Jesus literally rose from the dead. I also don't believe that Jesus actually appeared literally to these people. There are other explanations that fit the data. The problem I said was, I don't have a time machine. I can't go back and say what they actually saw. I can't say what they actually experienced. We have many possible, very good, valid explanations, if you want to take a natural approach, as to why it could be someone's traumatic experience of a loved one after they die. We know that people hallucinate, that kind of stuff. The problem is they want to talk about group hallucinations, which is why I brought up Fatima. Just bringing it up, like people all saw the Mother Mary in the heavens in some bright light. Did they see something? Were they looking up and they saw something and they're already primed to expect it? Maybe Jesus did go and say, hey, I'm about to get killed, but don't worry, God will raise me up. All right, I'm waiting for any little. Did you see that shadow that just walked? He's here. He's here. I can't tell you how many times when Christmas would come, me and my brother, we'd go up to Cooperstown, New York. We'd sit in the special room my dad grew up in and all the memories and stuff. And we would hear a noise thinking these were the bells from Santa Claus or like anything. We were psyching each other out. So I just throw that out there. Like, do you think they're looking up in the heavens and he's already ascended and they're having some like, did we just see him in heaven or something? What do you think?
Here's the thing people forget, and you certainly know this. We have one eyewitness account. We have an eyewitness account of this, not the Gospels.
Right.
Paul says, I have seen the Lord.
Right.
That's our only account. And when you ask him what kind of a body, he says, I don't know. God knows. He says that. He says, it'll be a body like the Lord has. I can't describe it to you. It'll be fitting for that new existence. Well, of course he could describe it if it was an apparition in the bedroom or anything of that. And then when he describes it, he uses the word glory, doxa. And he says, you know, when Christ, who is our King, appears, our commonwealth is in heaven, our government is in heaven, from which we await a Savior. This is Philippians 2. He says, who will transform metamorphosis, our lowly body, to be like his glorious body. Now, that's the guy that says he's seen it. So he uses the word glorious. Now, when we think of glorious, we think of blinding light, we think of something like Fatima, something heavenly. And he does say Jesus is now a life-giving spirit. He uses the term spirit. So I think it was some kind of phenomena, whether you need to literally look up with your eyes or whether you could experience it in your mind through meditation where you sense, but it absolutely, according to him, is something that's indescribable in terms of, I saw a figure at 6 feet high. It looked just like us, but it was kind of shining. He would have said that. And he says, I can't tell you, they're asking in Corinth, well, what kind of a body? What are you talking about? Christ was raised. You're the guy that saw him. And he goes, it's glorious. It's amazing. And then remember when he goes to heaven or to the third heaven, my book again, he says, I saw and heard things unutterable, meaning I can't really tell you what it was because it was so amazing. And so I think that I would stick with the one eyewitness account that we have. And I think that fits Mark because what the women are told at the tomb is, you'll see him in the Galilee as he said. And when did he say? Some of you standing here will not taste of death till you've seen the kingdom come with power. In the Galilee on a mountain.
Isn't that the transfiguration? The transfiguration is kind of a reflection of this very thing you're talking about, Paul's witnessing.
Absolutely.
So there's no give me a fish sandwich, Jesus says. No, that's late stuff. So okay, this is
and
good.
That's apologetic to in fact say it's not a ghost, it's not an apparition, it's not a bump in the night, it's not your Christmas bells ringing that is a figment of your imagination. The guy sat and ate with us. Paul gives no testimony like that. He didn't sit down and have dinner with Jesus. So and also the chronology of it. Now, you know what my favorite text is on resurrection is the Gospel of Peter. The ending of the Gospel of Peter, which says, we wept and mourned for 7 days. The 7 days of unleavened bread. Friday night starts Passover, right? Mm-hmm. For 7 days you eat unleavened bread if you're Jewish, if you're following the Jewish tradition and teaching in the Torah. So he's weeping and mourning for 7 days. He's saying, we apostles wept. Why are they weeping? And then he says, I'm going back fishing, which you also have in John. I'm going back fishing. Well, if they've been seeing him all week and eating with him, why are they mourning? They should, it says he appeared among them for 40 days, not according to Peter. So the Gospel of Peter is a account that preserves for us this Galilee memory. I believe the recovery of faith was in the Galilee, and it was something akin to a transfiguration. And I think it was like a blinding light or some experience, maybe with a voice or something like that they could not account for. But it certainly wasn't a resuscitated corpse walking around showing his wounds and eating fish. I think that has to be later. You have to line up the accounts and ask what appears to be the earliest, most credible. John 20, 1-10, ending of the Gospel of Peter, ending of Mark. Those are all consistent. And no corpses are walking around appearing to people and eating with them, right?
Yeah.
That's not. And then you got Paul before that who says, I can't tell you what kind of a body. Why does nobody pay attention? Nobody pays attention.
Yeah, I'm so caught up dealing with what's coming at me from apologists. This isn't something that I focused on, but I'm really glad that you brought it to my attention. This is exactly my point. We just don't have good data to know exactly what the heck was going on.
But we have an eyewitness who says, I can't tell you, but I did see.
Let's trust the guy who says he saw him, right? At least, or saw it, whatever it is.
Still haven't solved what it is, but at least you can solve what he said he saw, which is, I don't know what I saw.
Right.
But it was Jesus.
Yeah, and it's kind of wonder what could explain it. It could be who knows what.
Well, what about the Book of Acts? It's a blinding light and a voice that leaves you just dumbfounded.
Yeah, no one else heard it but him. So if you go and tell this testimony, if you're convincing enough, people make Joseph Smith literally has an entire religion built out of him and his one, he's the main guy who has a vision, and it all starts from this one guy. So you kind of wonder. That brings me to other questions, but let me get these super chats, and maybe we can get to 1 Corinthians 15 on the groups that are being described here. And is this possibly a later creed? Because there's one question I have in that. Bernhard Kurt, thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. I did not see a question. Thank you so much for the support, just showing love. And all right, let's not be distracted at the end. I want to come back to it if we can, Dr. Tabor.
And I've also got to limit my time here too, because I have a family dinner tonight.
Okay. So we'll run through these, and then I just got one question, and then we'll go. Do you think the Gnostics were inspired by Zoroastrians or maybe by Jews who were themselves particularly influenced by them? Thank you, Stop Skimming Man.
I actually think, thank you for that question. I think that kind of dualistic idea, in nascent form at least, has already reached the Greek world, very possibly from the East. By the time of Plato, Empedocles, and others, if you read Plato's Timaeus and so forth, Poimandres, which is a later text, but built upon this Neoplatonism. So I think this idea of a demiurge, of a sub-creator of the lower spheres, this has already been developed. Now, he says the Gnostics usually means the Christian Gnostics. They would be latecomers to the game, and then they begin to add all kinds of things like Satan and, Marcion's idea and Epistle to Barnabas and so forth. But that sort of dualism, I hate to keep mentioning my book, but Paul's Ascent to Paradise goes through all those more older texts like the Mithras liturgy, the Greek magical papyri, Poimandres, as well as some of the Platonic texts, and shows you it's just in the air. And it has to do with feeling that we're at the bottom of an alienated cosmos in which the higher good powers are far, far away. And yet we're like diamonds in the mud. We've fallen down into this state. So the classic Gnostic question is, who are we? What are we? From whence have we fallen? And whither are we headed? So it's sort of like, how did we get here? It's not the good world of Genesis 1, where you're all happy about being alive. It's like, how did we get here in this miserable world of evil and sin and death, suffering? It's sort of Buddhist Hindu in that sense. Certainly the Buddha had these same insights. And then the answer would be, well, you don't even belong here. You're a stranger in a strange land. And the earliest text I know testifying to this are these little gold foil plates, they call them. You can roll them up. They're like gold tinfoil. And they write on them prayers and what for the dead. And what you're supposed to say when you get to Hades is, I'm a child of earth and heaven heaven alone is my home. And if you, quote, know that, the guards will check you out. And if you truly know who you are, heaven alone is your home, they'll let you leave and go up to heaven. And that dates back to the 4th century BC at least. But I do think it came from the East. I do.
Thank you so much.
The Silk Road, the trade routes, they're going full swing during this whole period.
Thank you so much for that. Stop Scamming Man. Scott Duke, which non-canonical Acts Gospels do you recommend?
Whoa.
Huh?
I got to think about that.
Well, you did mention the Gospel of Peter, just so people can hear the end of the Gospel of Peter.
Yeah, of course, the beginning of it is crazy as hell, but so, with the talking cross that's 200 feet high and so forth. But, I would just read them for entertainment. I like Paul and Thecla. I like the Acts of Paul, but they are so legendary and so far-fetched and so, I know a lot of people would say, what are you talking about? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are that. Well, it's a different world, talking animals and Jesus making clay birds and say fly and Jesus jumping off a roof and not being hurt and striking kids dead and I mean, you can find stray stories in the Hebrew Bible that are just weird. But I don't know. I feel like we're in a different world with those. I think you can find things within them that could have some historical value, but I think sometimes they're written for entertainment.
Yeah.
You could picture people almost enjoying hearing the adventures, of Paul and Thecla with their mean, ugly husband. And she's so beautiful and wonderful, and she loves Christ, and she'd rather go with Paul. And he's chasing her down, trying to kill Paul because he took away his beautiful wife. I mean, it's just, talk about a trope. It's just classic, But I don't know. I tend to stay with what we have. It's not because they're in the New Testament. I think they're probably the earliest.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the earliest, they're still developing. Of course, they're legendary and they're mythological. Of course they are. But they're still coming from the first decades, first 100 years or so of the movement. And so it hasn't gone out into the embellishment that you get all the way down to the Middle Ages, where it just gets wilder. Mary Magdalene goes to France, and Jesus has a bunch of kids, and then you go to Glastonbury, and Joseph and Jesus used to take trips there, and Joseph planted a tree, and it's a different world.
Yeah. Well, thank you so
but
much.
I would say read them. You should
just read far and wide, right? Just read. Yeah, I definitely need to read more of those texts as I'm engaging more in this and finding out sources even that I think the Quran's using. Or is aware of narratives that have kind of been passed down into these regions where Constantinople, they only went so far in being able to stamp out some of this literature. I think some of this literature went all the way down into Arabia, and this is where we find kind of the continuation of the ideas going on and maybe finding it in the Quran. Don't want to get caught up there. Last question, because I know you got to go, and this family dinner is super important in light of your current situation. The group appearances in Paul. So one could approach us and say, Paul wrote it. We don't even know what he means when he says he appeared to the 12. What's that mean individually? Does that mean he appeared to them all together somewhere? What the heck does this even mean? There's another way of approaching this and saying, hold on, 500 and some are still alive. Couldn't this be a late in the day creed that was added? Like some skeptics think, because the Gospels don't mention him appearing to the 500 anywhere. The closest you get is Acts. Pentecost might have been misinterpreted to mean 500, or there might be something there. Some try to argue. The question is, why, if he appeared to 500, and these are kind of apologetical gospels, nowhere in there are they mentioning this. You would think they would have known Paul said this. So some want to say this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 in this section is later, not an early thing. It would make sense of if Paul's the eyewitness and he's constantly combating these other apostles, really saying they're not real apostles. What did it mean to be an apostle? That they saw the Lord. It seemed that they had been commissioned by the Lord himself. And Paul claims to have had that personal commission. So if Paul doesn't think that they're really true apostles, would he be going to bat for them in 1 Corinthians 15 and saying, hey, he also appeared to Cephas, and he appeared to so-and-so and so-and-so. And what is it meant that he appeared to them? In what form? Did they all have visionary bright lights in the sky that they equated to mean Jesus? Or what's going on? And I just didn't know how you personally solved that problem.
Yeah, it's too much to cover in
I know.
a few minutes, but I say a few things. I would just cluster the 500 with the others. I think, remember, Luke's the one who says, don't leave Jerusalem until Pentecost. Well, according to that, they're stuck in Jerusalem the whole time, so these Galilee appearances aren't even valid. You ever thought about that? Mm-mm. He says, stay in the city, you can't leave. So Luke is trying to push everything down to Jerusalem and the Jerusalem church, and he's building this whole construct that we have to really question in terms of historical validity. I think it's much more likely that the recovery of faith was in the Galilee. Paul is a latecomer, but the experiences that they had, Peter, James, the 12, all the apostles, and the 500, are these kinds of sightings that they begin to have up in the Galilee. in which, we just don't know the details. But it could be something like Fatima, where you can have mass appearances. The word could have spread around the Sea of Galilee, or Matthew mentions a mountain, as does the Transfiguration, which usually is understood to be Mount Tabor, but I think it's probably Mount Hermon up to the north. That's where it's said in the Gospel of Mark. So I think it's, apparitions is not a bad word necessarily. It means appearances or sightings. You then have to say, well, was that delusion or was it?
Yeah, I mean, was Elvis really showing up to people? That's the real question.
Yeah, and that's right. So yeah, exactly. And I think we don't know, but what we do know is what Paul reports, because he likens his experience to that. I do think the break with the apostles came later, and it was precipitated by other things. Probably when he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, he certainly accepts those who are apostles before me. They're apostles. So
we did have someone sneak in a super chat on our way out. This is literally it. So Grace 174, thank you for the super chat. How much would it devastate skeptics' explanations of the Jesus events if there was a 40 AD copy found of one of the Gospels? Could they still make do?
I think, it would have to do with what was in it.
What if Mark was, let's pretend Mark, it's our earliest, that's 40 AD. Is it possible? I guess it's possible. Imagine, there's a lot of people who argue this. I think it makes better sense as post 70. But if we said this was 40 AD, would it still make sense? And could a legend develop, say Jesus died in 30 or 33 within 7 to 10 years? Yeah, absolutely. You could have a legendary document completely made up, but would it devastate skeptics? I don't see how it would. In a decade, you could have anything kind of come up and be created.
As I get older, I realize that remembering things 20 years ago is not that big a deal. I mean, I've been teaching at UNC Charlotte 33 years. I'm not senile. And I remember very vividly the day I arrived on campus. You say, that was 33 years ago, Dr. Tabor. I even remember where I parked. I remember all kinds of things.
Wow.
So memories and who you met and who was chair then and who was on, I could name who was on the faculty then. It's not because I sit down and review it. This is my life. I lived it. So this idea, Richard Balcom, I like a lot. He's more of an evangelical than I would be, for sure. But he has this book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, in which he tries to argue that the early Christian movement is embedded in a kind of a memory history where there's a lot of exchanges. So you can refer to Rufus and what's his brother's name? The guy who carries the cross, Alexander. He's Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. This is just like and that's in the Gospel of Mark. And we actually have the ossuary of Alexander and apparently Simon. It's in a single ossuary, and they're from Cyrene. So that's real. Those people existed. But Mark seems to think his readers would be, oh yeah, I met Rufus once. Wow, that's amazing. That guy, why should we be so surprised at that? It's a movement, and we have some records that float around, and there's some artifacts that have been discovered. But that doesn't account for the mythological side, as most of us would see it. Or I say most of us, you and I certainly would think this,
right?
Of sightings and apparitions of how they came to faith that Jesus is ascended to heaven, sits at the right hand of God, is going to return again in judgment, has a glorious body, is going to raise the dead, meet them in the air, and all of this. That has nothing to do with whether they could remember Rufus and Alexander and Simon. That just means they were real people who had names and knew each other and believe pretty crazy things.
Everybody, please go subscribe to my friend Dr. James D. Tabor. In October, I'm going to Israel with him. We are going to film. He has so much insight. He's dug at many sites there. We're going to be all over the place. I just can't wait to go. It'll be the first time ever. And of course, lots of great content. We're going to get together. He has a blog as well. I've been sending links in the chat. If you're showing up late into this chat, you're going to want to rewatch this episode. Great content is covered, but I also put those links in the description of the video as well. So make sure you go subscribe to his blog. It is free. Go sign up. Trust me. There's going to be future offers and things he's going to be able to bring. Trust me when I say get on it now, Myth Vision. I promise.